Welcome to the fourth in this Newbie Introduction to Espresso series. I'm Dan Keene from Home Barista. Joining me are...
I'm the newbie.
Exactly. And so what we're going to do this time is we've already covered taste appreciation. We've covered the grinder. We also covered, we had a third one. Oh yeah, there was a third one on mechanics. And now this time we're going to talk about something that is often neglected, especially for people who are new to this, is how to diagnose by taste. It's very tempting when you get a new piece of equipment to, instead of tasting the coffee, is to get a bunch of measures. Measure the temperature, measure the brew ratio. That's all well and good because you might be saying to yourself, well, I'm inexperienced. I don't really know what I should be tasting. But the problem is when you do that, a lot of times you go through a lot of coffee and a lot of frustration while not learning as much about taste and a lot about mechanics. So this time we're going to focus exclusively on diagnosing by taste. In a future video, if we can get you to come back, will be one where we will focus exclusively on diagnosing by mechanics. But we're going to focus on taste for this one.
Cool.
But before we do that, I'm sure the people on the forum would like to know, what has Philip been up the last month or so with his kid at home?
A lot of experimenting. I think the last session we had was probably the most helpful for me as far as diagnosing by mechanics. Because before I was running into problems with choking, I was running into problems where it was just flowing out everywhere, and I didn't really understand what I was doing, why I was doing differently. And after that session, I sort of knew, okay, I can actually adjust the grinder settings. I can actually really get more precise on measurements.
Good.
And then play around. And then the thing that I've been doing is that 20 to 30 second range, brew range, or whatever you call it, for it to come out. That's what I've been sort of focusing in on. And ever since then, it seems like it's been going better. I've been looking forward to this one because I still don't know what a good espresso tastes like and what it doesn't taste like. Coincidentally, and I won't go on too much, but our neighbors have an espresso machine.
Oh, okay.
Never use it. And they came over, or the wife came over with my wife, and she made her a cappuccino or something. And then she went back to her husband. She's like, I don't know what it is about their machine, but their machine makes magical coffee. and
Great.
And I'm sort of understanding what the problems that they're running, and they don't even use it because they don't know really what they're doing. So it's been very enlightening. I'm looking forward to this one.
Well, that's great because what you're starting to reach the point the point you're reaching is that you understand all the mechanics, you understand the basics, but you're saying, is there more that I can get out of this?
Yeah.
Right? So we wanted to get you from the level where you're just exploring to where you're actually exploring with some confidence, kind of like you were exploring with confidence the mechanics.
Yeah.
And the first thing to do that, and I prepared a little display for you to kind of make my point, is that this is a display of different flavors that you might experience in coffee. And so for the people who are watching, we have grapes, orange, apple, dried cranberry, blueberry. And then at the other end, away from the fruity sort of things, is more the things that you traditionally think of when you drink coffee. A lot of times when they drink coffee, the first thing you ask is, how did it taste? They'll say, well, it tastes like coffee.
Yeah.
Right, sure. That's because a lot of times they may be using an inferior coffee which doesn't have subtlety, or they might not have the vocabulary. So on the other end, more like the base notes are things what people traditionally think of with coffee, which is chocolates, nuts like almonds or walnuts. And I added, just for fun, there's a lot of descriptors you could use, but also some coffees have a certain funkiness, right? And so that's why I added mushrooms to this.
Interesting. I was wondering why those were on there.
Yeah, I figured you might, right? And so, it gives you an example of the flavors, This gives you an example of some of the flavors that you could see. If you wanted a more, complex overview, this is, let me see if you can see that. This is the chart that is published by the Specialty Coffee Association of America, which has a flavor wheel. Essentially, and it gives you lots of different descriptors. What you saw there was a small sampling of the most common flavors. What we're going to do now is that I'm going to prepare you a correct espresso, one, and I want you to try and make an attempt to use this. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to let you look at this for a few minutes. We're going to use some of these descriptors to see if you can add a more nuanced appreciation to the taste. And then we'll move on to an actual exercise.
All right,
so we're going to take a little break and we'll come right back.
Don't get your hopes up because I'll probably get it wrong.
No worries. Okay, well, let me go ahead and prep that up.
All right.
We're back. All the little things are out of the way, so we can go ahead and try these two side by side. Remember that when you taste here is that a lot of times people are, they're cautious about what they taste. When they see something, no one ever argues about what color it is. But people feel a little conscientious about when they go to describe. Yeah. So don't worry about whether you say something right or wrong. Okay. I mean, I've been in tastes where people have described things as tasting like Fruit Loops. Okay. So there's no wrong answers here. Okay. So let's go ahead and brew this up. I'm going to do it side by side so we can taste it together.
So once I tell you what it tastes like, I'll remind you that there's no wrong answers.
That's right. Exactly right. So if I try and correct you, you'll be able to say, wait a minute, we talked about this just a second ago. The blend that we're pulling here is from Counterculture. It's called Rustico. It's an organic blend. I've been giving you kind of beginner blends of late. Toscano that you've had before is that poured just a teeny bit fast, but that's fine. We're going to live with that. Toscano is deeply chocolatey. This one's a little bit different. Okay. So go ahead. I recommend you kind of give it a little bit of swirl like this, and give it a taste. Okay, fair enough. Okay, well, let's start out with some simple things. Would you describe this as chocolatey? Let's start with what it's not. Is it chocolatey?
A little bit.
A little bit, fine. Yeah. Does it have fruits in it? Like, for example...
That was the first thing that came to my mind. Exactly. It was like a berry type.
Very good. In fact, this one isn't one of my better extractions. This one I think is off a little bit. That's fine. We were just playing this morning. This one, when it's pulled just right, will have a little bit of cranberry in it. Yeah. And here you still taste that. Do you taste kind of it's more of an orangey sort of thing, maybe like a red orange, or not so much grapefruit. So as you think along the extremes, there are fruits like, kiwi, right? It's got a little bit of acidity. But it doesn't have the acidity like, oranges. Right. You see, and so think along those, when you try and come up with flavor descriptors, start thinking about when you're eating now and then, think about what are the characteristics that are associated with coffee that you also recognize in foods.
So this is a good tasting espresso.
Actually, in all fairness, I think we're going to do better. Okay. And the next one, right. This one is acceptable. If I were ranking this during competition, this would be considered acceptable. But it would not be considered, that's a little bit below my normal average, which is fine. I had been just dialing in early this morning, and I switched portafilters and baskets, and that may well explain. Point being is that the characteristics of the coffee, though, are still there. Okay. You see? And remember you were talking about, before the break, you were saying, I like this coffee, but I feel like it could be better, was really what you were saying in some regard. And so this is what we're talking about here is that recognizing what qualities it has might tell you which way do I need to push. And that's what we're going to do in the next segment is we're going to divide this into threes. It's called the test of thirds. In the test of thirds, what you do is you, instead of extracting into a single cup, you split it across three. Okay. And by doing that, you can see that as the extraction progresses, the flavor profile changes. And one way you can manipulate the flavor profile is by controlling those aspects of it. And this is a really good way of recognizing what are the key characteristics of a given coffee, because coffees taste different in their first, second, and third one.
That's really interesting, because one thing that I usually notice when I drink a straight espresso is that the very bottom of it is sort of like the, whoa. Type, right. And so I don't know if everything settles or if that's because I'm not stirring it up or...
That is what's causing that, is that people often don't realize that espresso is a layered drink. usually.
Okay.
And so that first, in the test we're about to do, you're going to see that much more dramatically.
Okay, cool.
But remember I asked you, I said, hey, could you swirl that for a second?
Yeah. That was foreign to me. I was like, okay.
That's exactly why I asked you to do that.
Okay.
Because otherwise, you might get a different flavor profile. You know, some people like to have, you know, it be consistent throughout. Some people like
that different flavor sequence.
Right.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and set up for the test of thirds, and we'll be back in just a second. We're back, and we're going to do now a test of thirds. What that does is divides the extraction into 3 parts, and you're going to taste some of those differences we were talking about that you mix together. Okay. So what we do is we move this across, and then as it pours, we'll move to the next one. So first third, second third, and third third. And that's approximate, but that gives you an idea. Now what do you notice about that right away?
Color.
Right.
Yeah, it goes darker to lighter.
Right. So, I mean, that's not too surprising because as, you know, blonding, that's a natural sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But I want you to give these a taste now. Okay. And going from the leftmost one to the first third to the last third, and give me your impressions.
Okay.
Just a little bit, if you don't mind.
Very strong, almost like a bitter type quality.
Right.
Yeah.
It's bitter, right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, there's no way other word for it is that it is bitter, but it's got an intensity. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I would describe it as dark chocolate, like baker's chocolate, for example, might be it.
Yep.
It's also got a very intense the nuttiness. Do you pick up on that?
Yep.
It's very intense in this first third. So now let's try the second third.
Okay. Similar, but just not as intense. Comparison-wise, I don't know.
Okay, let me see what I think.
I mean, I can still taste a little bit of chocolate in there.
It's funny, a lot of times what we refer to this as the crowd pleaser.
Really?
Well, because you'll notice that this has, you know, it's not too bitter.
Yeah.
It's not too, you know, it's kind of in the middle.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like the Goldilocks thing, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, it would smooth out the rough edges on that first one. So let's try the last third.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't really get any bitterness in there. Almost like it's got a better aftertaste than the others, less intense.
The funny thing is that so many people, they think that the last part of the extraction is bitter.
Really?
And yet, yeah, I know, it's funny. And you said just the opposite, right?
Yeah.
In fact, you're correct.
Okay.
That's a common misconception, is that the last third, people say, oh, if you let it run too long, it'll be bitter, right?
Yeah.
Well, the fact of the matter is the last third tends to be pretty boring, honestly.
Yeah. Well, my first thought was regular coffee.
Yeah, well, that doesn't say a lot for regular coffee, but it's probably pretty accurate.
Well, I mean, it's not like the, you know, intensity and flavors and all that you get, I think, in a full espresso. At least for me, it just tastes. That was my first thing that came to my mind. It's like a regular coffee, strong coffee, of course.
When you make things like lemonade or vinaigrette or something like that, you take components that individually are really not so palatable.
Yeah.
Lemon by itself, water, of course, is not, and then sugar, or vinegar and oil and whatever, and spices and such. But together they produce a nice flavor profile that's enjoyable, right? And in many respects, that's what you're doing during the extraction, is that you're controlling that, which components you extract first. Like in the first part of the extraction tends to be, you know, a lot of the, maybe you might not notice this, but it's actually where most of the sugars are coming from. It's from the first third. Okay. Because those are the ones that are most easily soluble. But it also tends to pick up, you know, a lot of the intensity from the coffee itself. Yeah. And the last third is where it's also easy to tell where it's going to go. At that point, the taste almost becomes sort of bland, woody. It's very much like poorly made coffee. I mean, that's kind of a sad statement about the state of coffee in the United States, but it's true, right? And so what we're going to do is that we can use that knowledge to manipulate it. So there's really kind of two goals in this exercise. The first goal is to recognize how to manipulate good coffee to make it better. You see, which is what we're doing here. In the last part, you get to have your usual test. And your usual test, remember we always have something where we challenge you to try something, right? I'm going to intentionally do something wrong. I'm going to hope that you have picked up enough information along the way to be able to have a clue about what had gone wrong. You see,
so I was supposed to be paying attention.
You were supposed to be paying attention. That's right. So let's go ahead and let's go ahead and work on that next segment, and we'll be back in just a second. We're back, and we pulled two different extractions. One was the spot-on one, and one is different. And so your goal is to try and describe the taste difference. You don't have to diagnose what went wrong or what I changed, but just say what's different. So here we go. Bachelor number one. And now give this one a try. Now you notice I didn't stir it this time. That's fine. If you want to, you can. So hopefully you taste there's a difference.
I do.
Okay.
This one tastes stronger. This one was a little bit more bitter.
Okay, so that did produce the effect that I wanted, and actually it's interesting because what I did was I changed the temperature, and I changed it rather dramatically.
Well, that's okay. So that's what I got. I didn't want to, again, being cognizant, and I didn't want to say the wrong thing. One of them tasted really hot. And I was like, whoa, I wasn't used to being so hot.
Maybe that's a little bit of a cheat because, I made it dramatic enough that the temperature may have given you a clue. But you raise an interesting point is that I dropped the temperature, which traditionally people think of as sourness, right? But it's funny because when we describe things as sour, there's really a lot of there's really sourness is really a negative descriptor for acidity. Because if you think about it, yogurt or yogurt is probably the best example, is considered a positive sourness, right? But milk, if you're pouring it out in the morning and it comes out chunky, is a very negative one. And yet they're really the same sort of basic flavor of sourness, right? And so sometimes what people do is when they describe acidity, which acidity is that tanginess we're talking about, is sometimes it can be described as a positive thing, which is typically they'll use words like sour, and sometimes it's a positive thing, which they'll describe as fruity. So they're really flip sides of the same coin, right? So let's give this another taste test now that's cooled down a little bit to see if your impression changes, because sometimes when espresso cools, the differences become more noticeable. So let's go ahead and give that a second try. You pick up any differences this time?
Yes. This one tastes more fruity.
Yeah, right. A lot of times when people drop temperatures, when you want to, and this actually, it's good you bring this up because this brings us to our next point, is that we really haven't talked about, we're talking about how you diagnose or what you look for to diagnose, but we really haven't talked about how you do it, right? What do you change, right? And one way that you can affect the acidity level is by changing the temperature. So if you think about it, as you rack the temperature up really high, acidity tends to drop. As you go lower, the fruitiness increases. But you also can increase sourness, which some people will call bitter, some people will call sour. It depends on the person's taste profile, what they prefer. But temperature is one way that you can control the acidity balance, acidity-sourness balance. Another way, and actually this is where I'm going to refer to some of the references in the forums. There's a wonderful one which is the Home Barista's Guide to Espresso, written by Jim Schulman. It has 2 pages which really talk about what we're covering here in this video about how do you diagnose taste defects? What do you do to correct them, right? And those are where most newbies start. But the next level is also written by Jim Schulman, a wealth of information. He wrote another short, less than one-page guide, which is how do you dial in the extraction profile you want by changing the grind and dose. So for example, remember we talked about the thirds and how that, as you slow a pour down, the first third starts to take over. As you speed it up, the last third starts to come into play.
Yeah.
And so you can control that by changing the pour volume and consequently the grind size. You can control that balance by doing that. So that's when you're dialing in something which is already basically correct, but you want to manipulate a little bit. Versus the other page that I referred to is really for getting in the ballpark. And so you have to think about taste diagnosis as really a two-stage process. The first stage is correcting gross errors. And that's where you're looking at, you might get out your timers and whatnot like you had. But then once you get past the gross errors, you want to talk about, how do you correct the minor, the tweaking errors. And here we show an example of that. We manipulated the acidity, produced a more flavorful fruit profile. One thing that I was hoping you'd notice, but maybe you didn't, is that did you notice that the first one was sweeter in the beginning? And so when you talk about fruitiness, a lot of times, and this is where it can be confusing, because remember we were talking about lemonade. Lemonade still tastes pretty sour. Or right? But you've mixed two things, and so it's palatable. And so you can see how you're using the sugar content to balance off that acidity, producing a pleasant balance. Well, what did you add to it? You added sweetness. But a lot of lemonades, would you describe it as sweet like ice cream or sweet like Coca-Cola? No, not really. But even Coke kind of takes, or Coke or Pepsi, takes the opposite approach, right? It has heavy sweetness, but it absolutely has some acidity too, right? Because otherwise it would be sickeningly sweet. So, there's an example of where you can see drink manufacturers, or you're making it at home, you manipulate those to produce a different profile. So there it is. That kind of summarizes for this session what are how you can diagnose or learn about how to diagnose it. In the next section, the next video, we're going to explore a bit more about what changes we could make and how to manipulate it. You see, so this is more of a taste appreciation diagnosis. The next one will be the mechanics of that.
Sounds good.
Any other closing comments before we wrap here?
I think that's good. I'm looking forward to the next one because now I'm starting to get more and more confused. Now that you're adding heat and all these other things, I thought that I was starting to get it all figured out.
Well, and you'll see it's kind of like someone who learns to love beer making at home. It starts out simple, and then they find out that there's a lot of options, and that with those options becomes a little more complexity, but also it makes it a more rich experience.
Exactly.
So we'll see you all in about another month or so. Thank you.
Cool. All right.
Done. Well, guess what? We have a bonus feature. We were getting to wrap up, and then Phil started asking some questions, and so we're going to go ahead and look at what he wanted to look at. What was your question again?
Of course, I waited for all the right questions off the camera. But what I was telling Dan is that at home, in the last video, he threw in temperature there, but really the main variables that I'm playing around with is just dosing and then grind settings. So I talked to Dan, and I said, that's where I'm having issues as far as distinguishing what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong, and how do those, or one of those two variables, adjust the taste. So I think what he's going to do is he's going to change one of those two variables, either grind setting or dosing. I don't know which one is which, and I'm going to taste it and see which one I like better and see if I can figure it out. So
great. Cool. Let's go ahead and do that. So we'll go ahead. You should look away. That's fine. That's cool.
I'm looking at. So you're looking for. I'd be interested. I'm just from what I've learned, if I could even tell the difference. Actually, I will look away.
I was telling Philip during the break that when I do this myself at home. I do it by blind tasting. I put on a Lazy Susan. So I mark the bottom of the cup and then spin it with my eyes closed and then taste it. And if I can identify a taste defect 4 times in a row, then I consider it statistically significant. So,
it's a good way of doing it with you.
Now, Fortunately, this one is not quite so hard, so go ahead and give it a try.
Okay.
Okay, and now we have the other one. And let me go ahead and give it a taste. Yeah.
So this one tastes more stronger and more flavorful. Flavorful.
Flavorful, right.
Yeah.
And so, you know,
and this was the one on this side, right? It was like this.
Correct. Yeah. And so, you know,
that one tastes more flavorful.
Which was exactly the one that we were sticking to. So this was the standard one that we had pulled. So that's dialed in correctly.
Okay.
And so what I changed is I reduced the amount of coffee by 1.5 grams. You see?
Yeah.
So it caused a taste shift. Now, what was the shift that you noticed? I mean, you said it was less flavorful.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it was I could taste more of the flavors, like the nuttiness and the richness, I guess, of it, where this was more bland.
Right. And
it was still good, but it didn't have the flavor of that one.
Right, and that's what, you know, one of the taste diagnosis things we talk about with manipulating the dosing is, especially as coffees age. Now, this is very fresh coffee. Okay. But if you have coffees that age, so a lot of times people will compensate by adding more coffee, which produces this effect you're talking about. So if you have a coffee that's, you know, very fresh and spot on, but then it starts to fade as the days go on, you can increase the dose a little bit, and that will amp it back up.
Could you also make the grind finer? Would that be another way in keeping the dose the same?
It turns out I brought that point up in the forums. It was kind of a controversial comment. Is that, you know, most seem to agree that adjusting fineness was a way of prolonging a coffee that's in its prime to prime just a little bit off. Versus if you take a coffee that is past its prime and do the same thing, it'll become it will become bitter and harsh, as opposed to, whereas if you increase the dose and make it coarser, I know how, it seems almost counterintuitive, right? But increase the dose and make it coarser, that will prolong the sort of flavor profile that you had in the beginning.
Well, this is great, because these are the errors I'm making, dosing and grind settings. And so now I can actually taste the difference between one that's properly done and one that's not. Where before I wasn't really sure if there was a taste difference between that. So.
Well, what we can do is that, you know, we'll give you a homework assignment. Is that when you have the next month or so, when you have time away at home, you know, try and replicate this experiment. You know, to see if you can produce it at home, because ultimately that's the goal, is to say, I'm going to give you a more challenging coffee, and you want to make sure that you can manipulate the parameters we're talking about. But in the next video, though, we're going to take it a bit up to the next step and do more of what do we change and how does it affect. This is more of like a preview, so we'll consider this a bonus feature.
Awesome.
So we'll see you in another month.
Great. Thanks, man.